evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event, Immigration Today, Are We Abandoning Our Values? Featuring Susan Zesch and Alma Begich. This evening's program is put on by the Chicago Women's Alliance, which is an interdisciplinary shared interest group targeting women with significant life experience who are affiliated with the University of Chicago. We put on a number of programs throughout the year and focus on helping our members to network and to pursue their intellectual curiosity. So we have a few programs that are still coming up, one of which is on storytelling, narrative of self, others in change, which will be June 8th, midday from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m., and it will be down on campus, on the main campus. And then the annual Conversations and Connections. Are there people here who've been to Conversations and Connections before? Okay, we are looking for table topics. We have one in the hopper, but if anyone has suggestions or would like to host a speaker for a table topic, please let me know. And that is coming up on July 16th at 5:30 to 8:30 over at Cliff Dwellers. I'm Elizabeth Blakely. I'm chair for the Chicago metro area. Our moderator this evening is Leslie Recht, who's president of the Chicago Women's Alliance. She's a public policy consultant and a retired attorney. Retired? Reformed? Okay. Recovering? I'm not sure how long that recovery period is. I have that recovery period to look forward to as well. She's a past president of the board of the Cliff Dwellers, which we are not in this evening. I went there by accident, just so you know. She has extensive experience in community relations as a liaison between a Chicago alderman, the Chicago Public Schools, the Chicago Park District, and other community groups. She's a former adjunct professor of law at Chicago-Kent College of Law, my alma mater, where she earned her law degree. She's earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Recht.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. I'm what they call a national president. I know that most of you are familiar with the Chicago metro area and the programs that we do here, but we also have groups in New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and we are looking for somebody to be the Metro Chair in DC. So I just wanted to let everybody know that there are active groups in each of those areas. If you know anyone who's a U of C alum who might want to participate, see me, and Elizabeth Johnson is here. She can raise her hand. We have a number of people who are on the board and who are very active with the group. You also should have gotten emails telling you about the election. During the month of April, there are a number of positions that are available, director at large, some of the other positions that we have. If you're interested in any of those positions, please submit a name, fill out the form. If you'd like to be active in another way, we're happy to have everybody participate. So I just wanted to give that little plug so that you know we're looking for anybody who would like to participate to be involved. You can work on a program, you can do other things with us. We're going to be planning for the next year very soon. So we're going to be looking for ideas, we're going to be looking for suggestions, and your feedback about what you like and what you would like to do in the future. Today we have a program on immigration, and it's close to my heart. I have wanted to do a program on human rights, public policy issues for a long time. We've got two wonderful speakers. I'm not going to give an extensive description. If you looked online, you saw lots of information about their background. But briefly, we've got Susan Zesch. Susan is a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago. She's been teaching a whole range of programs in the human rights area. She's going to get up and tell you a little bit more about what she does because she's been the executive director of the Posen Center and has been doing wonderful work across the board with that group, and it's good for you to get to know who they are. They always have programs at reunion. If you go to the university at that time, you can get to know them a lot better. And our well, Susan's going to give us an overview. She's an attorney. She's going to give us a brief overview of the current state of immigration law, a little bit of how we got there. We don't have too long, so we can't go through all the gory detail, but she is going to talk about that and talk a little bit about what in the world is going on today. I'm very interested in perspective of someone who's been involved in immigration for a long time to put what's happening today in perspective. And Alma Begich, I'm trying, she teaches at Loyola. She's been involved in human rights work for a very long time. The area that she concentrates in is Bosnia, and she's going to be giving us some of the insights that she's gotten in working on human rights efforts related to Bosnia, the refugees coming from that area. So without any further ado, Susan, please get us started.
Hi, good evening. I'm a 1972 graduate of the college. I majored in philosophical psychology, one of those new collegiate division majors that doesn't exist anymore. But basically what I say my undergraduate education did is it taught me how to think. And in my work as an attorney, I think that's been one of the greatest challenges for us, is to not only, during the 2 decades I was an attorney before I came to teach at the university, not only to think about what my clients' interests were, but think about the policies that framed their situation, how we got here, and how some of those policies might be changed. So tonight I want to talk first about sort of the values that we apply when we think about how immigration policy should be organized, then a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are today. And then, if I have time, I'm going to do a little bit of a case study about how the U.S. has applied the Refugee Convention and not, to talk about what I think is really a really interesting example of how the U.S. really did ratify an international treaty, change our laws to conform to what that treaty said we should do, and then for many years has done a, off and on fairly decent job of applying them. Up till today, I read the decision of the District Court of the Northern District of California throwing out the Remain in Mexico program, or suspending it, enjoining it, and thank God we have federal courts, that's all I can say. Let me read a quote from Martha Nussbaum. I think this is a nice place to start, as she is one of our most prominent women faculty members at the university. I also, before I do that, I wanted to wave the flag a bit about the Posen Center for Human Rights. We exist as an interdisciplinary center on campus, much in the way that the Gender Studies Center does, Latin American Studies, Middle East Studies, et cetera. Our mission is to infuse teaching and research about human rights across the departments of the university. We offer a very robust curriculum. About 80% of our students are in the college, and we are most determinedly a minor. We don't want to be a major. And I'll tell you why. We were the first minor, other than a foreign language, that they let be a minor without being a major. And we think that's because the understandings and analyses of many disciplines and professions are needed in order to understand human rights violations and look for their solutions. So I've been very pleased, for example, at the number of biology majors who have human rights minors, because they're going to medical school, and they knew they wanted to be doctors because they wanted to do good in the world, and a human rights minor helps them put a historical and intellectual and political frame around their good impulses. We also feel that teaching our students about human rights gives them a rights language that is common across the world. It helps them understand a grounding in civil rights, but then enables them to engage in international discussions. So if the goal of a liberal arts education is to make students into better citizens, we feel that human rights helps them become better global citizens as well. So let me read a quote from Martha Nussbaum that, to me, captures an idealized view of what we would like to see immigration policy about. And this is from her book, Frontiers of Justice, Disability, Nationality, Species Membership, 2007. We might realize a world that is just as a whole. in which accidents of birth and nationality do not warp people's life chances pervasively and from the start. Because all major Western theories of social justice begin with the nation-state as their basic unit, it is likely that new theoretical structures will also be required to think well about this problem. All of us have values that come from different sources, but I think that most of us believe in principles of universalism insofar as we ascribe to the notions that all people have a right to live a life of dignity and to develop their potential. I'm going to just leave that at that as kind of hovering above us as we think about what policy might actually be. And I realized I forgot to start my timer here. I was intending to go 20 minutes. All right. Now, when we look at migration policy in the United States, there are a lot of different sets of values that get applied, and some of them are stronger than others in certain periods. Some of them are dominant in the political world, some of them become important in Congress, others are neglected. And so some of those are a cluster that I would characterize as human rights, civil rights. Sometimes these come from religious creeds, but they believe strongly in principles of non-discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. So principles of justice are one part of how we determine immigration policy. Geopolitics can be very important in immigration policy. Principles of humanitarianism. And those come together in a program that the US Congress passed in 1980 as part of the Refugee Act, under which the United States brings refugees from around the world to the United States and helps them integrate into our society. These are not people who are presenting themselves at our borders and asking to be certified as refugees. These are people who every year between the White House and the Department of State, a decision is made as to how many people come in. Now, under previous presidencies, until the Trump administration, you could look at the annual numbers and see out of the 9 or 10 or 12 million refugees worldwide, how is the US going to pick who we want to invite in? And you might say, well, maybe the neediest, maybe the people who are most likely to be able to assimilate into US culture, maybe the people about whose government we want to send an international message. This government is treating its people horribly, we're going to welcome them to the United States. And every president has come up with a different formula of that, and until the Trump administration, the numbers would vary between about 50 and 100,000 per year. The Trump administration, I think, does not believe in the basic principles that formulated this program. They don't believe in humanitarianism. Their geopolitics is somewhat skewed towards abandoning the North Atlantic Alliance and looking for alliances with dictatorships around the world. So the refugee program, which I think Alma's going to talk about later, has gotten really reduced and distorted in the last couple of years. The numbers have gone way down, and the bugaboo of security as being part of the screening has slowed down, even admitting the numbers of people who the White House said at the beginning of the fiscal year they would admit. So, non-discrimination, human rights, civil rights, geopolitics, humanitarianism, due process. Due process means basically that the rules are established in advance. That's what the rule of law is about, and that someone who is going to qualify for some sort of immigration benefit knows what the rules are before they get applied to them personally. We see now tremendous discretion among consular officials where they are given tremendous authority to deny visas based on arbitrary and capricious standards. I sat next to someone yesterday on the plane coming back from San Francisco, where I had given a Harper lecture to the Alumni Association there, who said that her engineering company used to be able to count on being able to bring in some of its employees from England to do temporary work. And now the ridiculous lengths to which security questions are being put to people who are coming in what should be pretty easy intercompany transfers have really stymied her company's capacity to get its work done in the way that it wants to. Where do you put on limitations to preserve the goodies for a society? Now, there's an interesting philosophical debate that I've taught to my students between the philosophers Michael Walzer and Joseph Cairns. And Cairns is an open borders guy. He teaches at the University of Toronto, and he wants there to be free transit across borders for all people everywhere. And in counter to that, Walzer raises questions about whether democracies, industrialized democracies, need to establish limits on entrance in order to preserve the goodies they have secured for their present citizens and residents. And this is it's an interesting debate that I give to my students, because I think that reasonable people will differ on how one does this. What about preservation of family unity? That might be part of humanitarianism. Congress in the past has ranked certain relationships as being more important than others and granted more visas to people. Congress loves love. If you marry a United States citizen, there is no annual quota on the number of people who can come in under that. Now, going back to the days of Senator Paul Simon, I remember that Congress decided they loved love, but they wanted to make sure it was true love. So they put a 2-year qualifying period on whether your new romance was going to lead you to citizenship. But basically, Congress has the power to decide whether siblings, grandparents, brothers and sisters, how many visas they would get a year. And these are debates that have circulated over the last several decades among Congress as to how family unity. Now, we have just seen the firing/resignation of Secretary Christian Nielsen, who I think, DHS Secretary Christian Nielsen, who I think will go down in history as having administered the most anti-family immigration policy one can imagine, a policy that brought thousands of people out in the streets in Chicago a number of months ago to protest the cruel and careless snatching of Central American children from their parents. And at a recent court hearing in front of a federal judge in Southern California concerning what was happening to those children, the government said they needed 2 years to reunite the thousands of children they had taken away from their parents because they just didn't have enough resources to put in it. And it's going to be a back and forth between the judge and the government as to how quickly they have to act. But it seems that for this administration, principles of family unity don't really count very much. And then you have appeals to racism, and whether those are politically valid in a particular period. And I'm going to do a little historical summary in a minute where you're going to think about how this has happened. Full-blown, full-bore anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Irish, anti-Asian have been, in certain periods of history, really large parts of the shaping of U.S. immigration policy. So, we have a lot of headlines about immigration. You can't miss it. You would have to be an ostrich, literally, with your head in the sand to not realize this is an important issue of public policy, the role of the state, who we are, national identity, and what of those principles I just listed are going to dominate in our determination of policy. The headlines talk about a crisis at the border. We're full, the president says, and there's a very interesting rebuttal to that by demographers in the current New York Times. It's an invasion, or as Sonia Nazario wrote in this really, those of you who still get the Times in print, Sunday review section, if you saw this, it's really an incredible article, and if you didn't, look it up online. The tagline for this is, "The United States cannot build a wall and expect women to resign themselves to being slaughtered." So that's another headline to deal with. Now, this afternoon, I decided in preparation for this talk, and then I didn't get enough time to do as much of it as I wanted to look at the 1907 Congressional Commission on Immigration, which was referred to as the Dillingham Commission. The Dillingham Commission was a commission which was going to determine on a scientific basis, in the frame of a pseudoscience referred to as eugenics, how racial differences among different groups of immigrants ought to determine how many people were let in the future from these particular groups. And I have to say, the hair stood up on the back of my neck as I read an article by the esteemed anthropologist Franz Boas about his measuring the skull sizes of Hebrews, and that there was something important about the ratio of the width of one's skull to the length of one's skull that could determine propensity to criminality. This is a scientific testimony before the U.S. Congress in 1907. as you know, the U.S. has gone through periods of opening and shutting doors. We have this myth about the 19th century being everybody can come in. In fact, the Midwestern states were funding the recruitment of immigrants from Northern Europe, but this was not a nation without borders or boundaries. In 1843, in the pre-Civil War period, there were a lot of state laws which precluded entry and settlement in particular states by free blacks, including Illinois. You were not allowed to settle in Illinois as a free black. And this rests on exclusionist policies that had existed in the colonies. Plymouth Colony would not let you live there unless you were a Puritan. So the idea that the U.S. had a completely open century, also in the 19th century, in the pre-Civil War period, British ships that docked in Charleston Harbor, in Charleston, South Carolina, had to, if they had Jamaican sailors as part of their crew, those free black sailors had to be given over to the sheriff of Charleston and put in jail for the time the ship was in the harbor because the city fathers were so afraid of slaves seeing free black men with money to spend walking around the streets. So the 19th century wasn't completely open, just the lines were drawn somewhat differently, and they weren't necessarily being drawn at the perimeter of the United States. Of course, the 19th century also marks our stealing 40% of Mexico's territory from them in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that's another long story among people who say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. But the real attempt to control immigration at the federal level begins in the 1880s with the gradual first refusal of additional admissions and then later exclusion and deportation of any Chinese, even those lawfully present in the U.S., if they could not prove the legality of their status by the testimony of 2 white witnesses. This was a period in which, however, the U.S. was going through tremendous economic expansion. So a value I forgot to mention, and I know we have a PhD in econ sitting here in the second row, are job market needs, which also have something to do with migration policy. Because in the 1880s, as we were shutting off, eventually by 1907, completely shutting off immigration from Asia, we started recruiting in Mexico. And what was going on in Mexico at that point was a time of great economic upheaval under the president, Porfirio Diaz, who was a reformist, caused so much economic hardship in the Mexican countryside that it led to the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. So before the outbreak of the revolution, we were recruiting thousands of Mexicans to come into the U.S. Why? We had just completed the Transcontinental Railroad with Chinese labor in the 1870s. We also had developed irrigation technology that was going to enable us to create farmland, productive farmland out of arid Central California and the Southwest. And so the combination of access to markets in the East through the completion of the railroad and new technologies which could change U.S. agriculture from the family farm to large-scale production, who was going to work in this? We just threw out the Chinese. We started recruiting Mexicans. So that's one trend that's going on. And the history of Mexican migration to the U.S., which I've taught entire courses on, goes through ebbs and flows based on U.S. perception of our economic needs. And really until the 1970s and 1980s, there were no policymakers talking about Mexicans as dangerous. That wasn't, or as unwanted, partly because most policymakers regarded Mexicans as temporary workers and not as future citizens. And so the idea that they would come into the U.S. and then go back was something that kept them immune from the 1920s restrictions on Southern and Eastern Europeans, which were basically anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic moves by the U.S. Congress that decided in 1922 and 1924 that they wanted to revert the picture of the U.S. population back to what it had looked like in 1880, and therefore they were going to restrict migration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Now, in my family, that has a big impact because my grandparents, all 4 of them, had migrated to Chicago prior to World War I, before these restrictions came in, met, married. They'd each come with a couple of siblings from big families, but after 1922 and 1924, even though they were doing okay in terms of their own economic well-being here, they couldn't bring any more family members over from Europe, leaving almost all of their relatives to die in the Holocaust, which is something we'll get to in a bit. So the 1930s is a depression in the US, and the US decides, well, we're going to start deporting people who aren't what we need in terms of workers, because we don't need very many workers. And there were massive anti-Mexican deportations in California, Chicago, other areas of the country which had concentrations of Mexican population, to the extent, I think, that in the 1930s, half of the Mexican population from the United States was either deported or left voluntarily because they were ineligible for most of the small existing social welfare programs of the period. But this reverses in 1942 when we have entered World War II, and all of a sudden we need to populate the factories because we're drafting Americans to go fight in Europe and in the Pacific. And so all of a sudden, turn around, Mexicans, we want you back again. And 42 to 45, interestingly enough, is the only period in which the Bracero program, as this temporary worker program came to be known, was actually negotiated as a bilateral treaty with the government of Mexico. Every other U.S. policy with respect to immigration from Mexico was a unilateral decision of the United States. But we were so desperate during World War II that the Mexicans were able to actually negotiate some beneficial provisions, one of which was no braceros were going to go to Texas, because Texas was known as being so racist that braceros were not to be approved. The Mexican government did not want its citizens going there. So the war happens in 1948, based on some regret about our failure to admit people trying to escape the Holocaust and our desire in a Cold War context, this is again geopolitics, to let in people who had fled from new communist governments in Eastern Europe. Congress passes the Displaced Persons Act, which is a humanitarian gesture. It's our first real refugee policy to bring displaced people out of these camps that had been set up in Western Europe. But Truman, in his signing message, said that he was reluctant to sign the Displaced Persons Act because it had been specifically set up as requiring that 30% of the entrants have prior experience in farming to keep down the number of Jews. And President Truman said, this is an explicitly anti-Semitic measure, but I'm going to sign it anyway because it's the best thing I can get out of Congress. And then there was an effort in 1952 to reform the Immigration Act to get rid of those dreadful quotas in the 1920s, but it lost. The McCarran-Walter Act was passed with those national origins quotas, limiting Southern and Eastern European migration, eliminating Asian migration. They didn't succeed in overcoming them, but one of the things that started happening in 1952 was that President Truman himself set up a commission to hold hearings around the country as a way of building support for what eventually would happen in 1965 when the national origins quotas were eliminated. Eastern and Southern European immigration were returned to sort of normalcy, and Asian immigration becomes possible for the first time. Hey, Leslie, can you hand me my water? Thank you. I appreciate it. I got it. My first appearance at an immigration meeting was apparently in the carriage in 1952 when I was a year old, when my mother showed up at a meeting of the Truman Commission as part of a delegation from the National Council of Jewish Women. So I get to say that I started immigration advocacy in the Truman era, but that would make me really old. 1965 does a number of things, and I think it's important to talk about, and I really only have about 8 minutes, but I think this is important to get down. Congress made decisions that govern the way we deal with Latin American migration today. They ended the Bracero program, which was notorious for its labor abuses, but they reduced the number. They placed a cap for the first time on the number of immigrants who could come in from Latin America. And they decided in a further reform of the law in 1976 that Mexico and the other Latin American countries should be subjected to the same annual quota of 20,000 then, now 25,000 per country per year that was applied to the rest of the world. And this quest for fairness actually is what created the illegality of Mexican migration to the United States, because what had been a flow encouraged by, I didn't even talk about special provisions for Mexican workers entering in World War I, the Bracero program in World War II, And of course, relatives of people come and they're able to settle legally, because if you didn't have a criminal record and you had a job offered to you, it was okay, you could come in and become a permanent resident. Suddenly changes what had been a cultivated, encouraged, legal flow of migration to being mostly illegal. Now, the fact that this was a mistake is apparent enough by 1986 that the Reagan administration institutes an amnesty bill which allows over 2.6 million people to become unauthorized residents, illegal aliens, in the way some of the press refers to them, to become legal residents and ultimately citizens of the United States. The other things that happened in the 80s were in 1980 we passed the Refugee Act, taking the treaty obligations under the Refugee Convention and making them part of U.S. law, and really enforcing it and interpreting it through the courts, like this decision today. And then there was a fight over what it meant, because the Reagan administration said, oh yeah, a refugee is somebody with a well-founded fear of persecution, but we like the Salvadoran and Guatemalan governments, we give them money, therefore if you're from El Salvador or Guatemala, how could you be a refugee? Because they're trying to inject geopolitics into what they had promised as a statutory remedy. This caused one of the largest civil society uprisings against U.S. immigration policy we've ever seen with the sanctuary movement. I remember being flown to a clandestine meeting in the basement of a motel next to an airport somewhere in the U.S. Southwest and talking to the heads of all the major U.S. Protestant denominations, the stated clerk of the Presbyterians, the head of the United Church of Christ. As a nice Jewish girl, I was quickly learning the differences between all of these Protestant denominations, but they were surely unified in their determination to save Salvadorans and Guatemalans from being deported to Central America. And they didn't want me there as a lawyer to tell them what they should do. They knew what they were going to do. They just wanted me to tell them what laws they were going to be breaking when they said about doing it. It was a very, so let me just, I'm going to skip ahead. You're not going to hear about Hannah Arendt. If somebody wants to hear about Hannah Arendt, you'll have to come take my course. But what I want to talk about is why I think we are in a sort of crisis today. I think we're in a crisis particularly with respect to people seeking asylum in the United States for a number of reasons. One is we have, and I'm not going to hesitate in calling him this, a racist demagogue in the White House who has no sense of humanitarianism and is really an isolationist, America first, doesn't want us to let anyone in, says the country is full, and is determined through the encouragement of the evil Stephen Miller, whose uncle wrote an editorial last year at Thanksgiving, some of you may have seen it, that he's a disgrace to the Jewish people, Stephen Miller, that considering the history of his own family, of what happened to them in the period I just recited of the Holocaust, how he can be taking the positions. The rest of the family denounced him. But they are determined to close the gates. The boat is full. Where the problem is that we have is that, yes, the U.S. has done what we were supposed to do. We ratified the Refugee Convention. We modified our laws to conform to it. We have courts interpreting them in ways that are to preserve access to due process, an ability to make your case. But one of the problems we have, which I present to my students, because they're going to be around many decades longer than I am, is that the refugee laws we have were written assuming that the harm that people were fleeing from was either being perpetrated by the state itself or by what the political scientists call non-state actors, but who themselves had a political agenda, a rebel group that wanted to take over a country, a government that wants to repress speech in order to keep itself in power. And now, with many of the Central Americans, and really you should read the Sonia Nazario article, and if you don't have a chance to read it, she's speaking in Chicago on Thursday at the lunch of Facing History and Ourselves, which my friend Maureen Loughnane, also an alum of the U of C, is the director of, if you want to hear her talk. Criminal organizations are not states. Now, they might be functioning like states in certain areas of some of the countries that people are coming from. They certainly are controlling. They have territorial control. They act in every aspect of life. One of my Mexican reporter friends said to me, Susan, you can't think of them as just being guys who want to get their product through town. You know, they're shipping drugs and they want the local authorities to ignore those trucks going in. No, they are in some ways pure capitalists. They want to extract money from every aspect of life. They extort kids for money as they're going to school. They extort shop owners. They want to coerce young men into joining their forces. They want to coerce women into having sex with them. They do horrible things to people who resist, but they're not state actors. We have also, in addition to the Refugee Convention, ratified the Convention Against Torture, which allows us to give safe haven to any person with a reasonable expectation they would be tortured. And it's very broad. The torture doesn't have to be for political reasons. It can be just because you lost $40,000 worth of heroin, and now after you served your prison term, you're getting sent back, and that gang that originally gave you the heroin to bring into the United States is gonna kill you when you get back. That's enough. Judge Posner has even said the torture convention applies to people who are likely to be tortured and doesn't have any other restrictions in it. So we have to think in new ways, as Martha Nussbaum suggests in the quote, about how we think about justice, where we have people who are fleeing from harms that are every bit as real as the oppression of pro-government death squads in El Salvador were in the 80s, as repression by totalitarian governments around the world have been for many generations. But where do we stand, and how are we going to protect those who come here seeking assistance? I want to make one suggestion, which is I think that we might start thinking about where is it that people are fleeing from horrible situations for which our government bears some responsibility? Is that a place to start? And how far does that go? So I'm just going to leave you with questions. I didn't get to say everything I wanted to, but I've talked more than I was supposed to, so I'm just going to let Alma take you from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. This was great. I will mention Hannah Arendt, so it's inevitable. It is absolutely beautiful to be here. Thank you all for coming. I am so glad to be back with the University of Chicago community. It's been quite some time, and I'm very happy to see some of my friends and colleagues here. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alma Begich, and I'm really impressed that my name was pronounced correctly. That doesn't happen too often. But I'm also here to brainstorm with you some of the issues that we are experiencing today. I will not focus on the US because Susan did that, but I will talk more broadly about the trends, about history, about where we are today, and some ways in which we can rethink the problems that we are experiencing today. So just to put it in numbers, today we are experiencing a situation where about 70 million people are on the go. And they are on the go for different reasons. They're uprooted and forced to leave their homes for the reasons that include wars, political change, climate change, all sorts of economic reasons as well. So as I was thinking about the ways in which I can approach this conversation about immigration today with you, I was really thinking about my own experiences in my life and what is it that I can share with you that it's relevant. And I then realized that I'm on the go too. I came here to Chicago as a refugee from Bosnia, and I had that experience of what it means to wait for the status to be determined, to what it means to be integrated in a new environment, what it means to reconnect, to learn the new language. So all these kinds of things I have experienced myself. So I realized as I start with that and then reflect on where I am today, that migration is not just crisis that we are experiencing today. It really is a way of life. It is what has been part of our lives, right? For me, as I made career choices, as I made education choices, they took me to different places. Some scholars, such as Jeremy Waldron, who is a professor of law and philosophy originally from New Zealand, are talking about the ways in which we operate today as a way to understand that we are having something that he thinks is a cosmopolitan citizenship, some concept that brings fluidity to identity that is hybrid, that is complex, and that's movable. And so I will quote him what he says. So today, a person of Irish background who lives in San Francisco and learns Spanish, eats Chinese, wears clothes made in Korea, listens to arias written by Verdi, sung by Maori princes on Japanese equipment, follows Ukrainian politics and practices Buddhist meditation techniques, does not necessarily find it threatening to his or her identity, right? So these various cultures have been bridging our everyday lives, shaping how we understand ourselves. Well, however, this is not reality, some critical scholars would say, for everybody, right? Not everybody experiences this fluidity in the same way. So the field of migration is rather big, and I am not an expert in it. I do have some of these experiences of moving to the US, then living in Chicago, and then going to Australia to get my PhD. So these are very different experiences that personally taught me about challenges and vulnerabilities that people experience when they are on the go. I think first important professional experience that I've had was really, and personal experience as well, was when I moved to Chicago and tried to navigate the system here. Luckily, I was a member of the City of Chicago Advisory Board on Immigrants and Refugees, which was a part of Chicago Council on Human Relations under Richard Daley administration. And as I was sitting around the table with representatives from different communities in Chicago, we then realized the kinds of problems people are experiencing when they come here. From being able to learn the language, to understand how healthcare system works, how to get a job, how to understand legal system, and all these challenges become important in terms of integration processes. I think another experience that I've had was really what happens to refugees once they go home. We have this expectation that once we've fled the country and settle in a new place and are able to integrate, when we go home, whatever country that is, we will be able to fit right in, right? But the point is the people change and their countries change too. So yet, as working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, at that time as a legal protection researcher, with the University of Chicago, this was my first human rights experience that I appreciate was a part of human rights program, really exposed me to challenges, to legal challenges that I didn't understand that returnees are facing when they're back home. They're safe, they're in their own country, but yet there are many legal challenges that come with that process, from administrative, very basic, to other much more substantial. Another experience with migration was when I was working as a U.S. representative with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I was a senior human rights advisor with the Victims Assistance Unit and became chief of anti-trafficking unit. And there I really realized the kinds of vulnerabilities people experience as they are crossing border. So I have dealt with the Eastern European migrants who were trying to apply for decent jobs and end up being victims of organized criminal networks, who ended up being victims of trafficking, and took a really long time and many and significant resources to pull judicial reform together and being able to provide response to these victims. And then going to Australia, it was also interesting experience in terms of understanding how migration issues are everywhere really around us. And when I came to Australia to get my PhD, this experience was entirely different. And then I realized that most people I did observe in Melbourne, where I studied, were really skilled workers from India and China. And and they had two-step program for graduate students who could then apply for visa to stay in Australia. But most of refugees and political asylum seekers were really not visible. They were outside, and so all these kinds of experiences have really opened my eyes to complexity of the issues that one who studies migration will be unpacking. So the point is just as well that we are currently living in times where we see movement of people that are uprooted for different reasons. And I think Susan mentioned that as well. Some of them are fleeing wars, others are fleeing repressive political regimes, others are fleeing organized gangs, some are seeking better economic opportunities, etc. But all these, although there may be different push factors, they really are happening at a time when we experience change in a globalized society, right? There is a different concept of nationality, citizenship, and rights that are getting new meanings today. And what we see worldwide, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, and Australia as well, is really backlash in terms of how the states are responding to immigrants and refugees by clinging on their ideas of nationhood and sovereignty and adopting policies of expulsion, restrictive migration policies, and we see inflammatory language against immigrants and refugees really worldwide, not just here. So are we losing our values? That's the question of the day. To start unpacking this problem, I think we need to go back to the word refugee and immigrants. What do they mean? What kind of meanings do they have today? And to answer or to start thinking about this question, I would go back to Hannah Arendt's article written in 1943 in the essay titled "We Refugees," in which on the first page she says, refugees don't like that label. They don't like to be called refugees. Instead, they prefer to be called newcomers or Americans of German language. And then she defines that previously what we thought about refugees are individuals who would be fleeing persecution for some political views. However, that really is now all of us, she says, I quote, all of us who have been so unfortunate to arrive in a new country without means and have to be helped by refugee committees. And I think what she's explaining here is really the level of vulnerabilities that people experience when losing home, occupation, and family and friends, and yet the expected optimism that is needed in order to integrate in new place. So the concept that she later developed, and Arendt as a Jewish person who was stripped of her German citizenship and was stateless for about 13 years until she became American citizen, explains that there is a paradox between how we understand universal human rights and how access to rights really works, right? In the sense that the right to have rights or the right of every individual to belong to humanity should be guaranteed by humanity itself. And yet, without political membership, accessing this right becomes a problem, right? That millions of people are lost and could not regain these rights because of the new global situation, and they belong to the human race as much in the same way as animals belong to specific animal species. So in other words, human rights system does not necessarily provide sufficient protection without political membership. And I think that's where refugees experience significant vulnerabilities. So one needs to be capable to access rights. And this concept was later developed by Amartya Sen, economist, who argued that there needs to be capability to access, in particular, socioeconomic rights in order to have good life. So post-World War II brought us reconfiguring of identities, of territories, but also brought us a system in which we have international structures such as NATO, United Nations system, we have World Trade Organization, and all these institutions are imagined to keep peace and order through diplomacy and coordination between states. We had in 1948 Genocide Convention, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1951 Refugee Convention, 1967 protocols, and all these have identified the rights, the protections, what are the state responsibilities, the fundamental principles of non-discrimination, non-penalization, and non-refoulement, that the states should not return individuals to the place where they may fear prosecution or experience torture or other inhuman or degrading treatment and other human rights violations. But this is exactly what we are experiencing today, the very dismantling of the system that we have created then. There are currently about 40 conflicts going on worldwide, and some of which have been going on for decades. About 70 million people are forcibly displaced. 40 million of these people are displaced internally, which means that they are within the borders of their own states. We have seen multiple genocides from Bosnia and Rwanda to some that are happening today. Syrian conflict has resulted in 12.6 million of refugees and internally displaced persons that are uprooted within and outside of Syria. Forced displacement continues to grow each year, and in 2017 we saw a growth to close to 3 million people forcibly displaced in addition. We see 10 million people who are stateless, from ethnic Rohingya Muslim in Myanmar to ethnic Haitians in Dominican Republic. We also see stateless people in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. Anyway, so on one hand, we have all this large movement of people that are trying to find safe places to integrate. And sociologists, meanwhile, have been studying globalization as a momentum in history where we see intensification of worldwide relationships that link distant places to other parts of the world. As British sociologist Anthony Giddens reminds us, globalization brought us changes in how we understand geography, time, and how we experience localness. And I'll come back to this when I talk about Bosnia. This was also echoed by Manuel Castells, another sociologist from Spain, who talked about merging time and space in a digital society and interaction between time and space, calling it timeless time. Saskia Sassen, another sociologist of Dutch background, Dutch, Argentinian, Italian, speaks 5 languages background, taught us also about the ways in which we have reconfiguring of nation state, the emergence of global cities, and different types of citizenship that is pushing against our understanding of what nation state is and the loyalties that we experience outside of that framework. Hannah Arendt thought that we live in one world, but we see now rapid changes of goods across the borders, services operating day and night, people crossing borders, free market, ideas of liberal democracy. Europe has received between 2015 and 2016 about 1 million people who were uprooted due to war and other types of insecurities. 90% of them had to pay smugglers and traffickers to get them across the borders. We all saw images from Greece and Italy of people drowning on these boats trying to find a safe haven. Between 2015 and 2016, Greece received about 60,000 people, and in 2018 received 30,000 additional people who came by the sea. So Europe is experiencing crisis. That's what I think, right? But the major pressure really is not there. It is in middle-income countries, and it's in neighboring countries of those that are in conflict. Out of 70 million uprooted people, most of them are in Turkey, in Pakistan, in Lebanon, in Iran, in Uganda, Ethiopia, and Jordan. And they experience extreme pressures in terms of their socioeconomic resources and infrastructure due to influx of large influx of population in their territories. Nepal has 13% of total population being refugees. Tanzania, 4-1 are refugees. Malawi, 10% of population. Lebanon has 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Its population was 4 million in 2013. It's estimated to have 6 million people. It is 19th the most populated country in the world. It has 583 people living on square kilometer. So Europe has experienced first a great refugee crisis since World War II in the 90s, since the end of Cold War, fall of Soviet Union, and the wars in Yugoslavia. In 91, it saw 50% of Croatian population fleeing the country due to war. And many of them ended up really, again, in neighboring countries, in Germany, in Hungary, Austria, and Sweden. Bosnian population saw genocide, and this was first genocide in Europe since World War II. And many of these tactics that were used by Nazis were really inspiring Serbs such as Radovan Karadzic, Biljana Plavšić, and General Mladić to do the same. 50% of Bosnian population had to flee the country. Many of them fled the country to stay in the neighboring countries, but some of them came here. So Chicago has a population anywhere between 30 and 50,000 and growing. St. Louis has the largest population of Bosnians there. So what is happening right now, I will not go so much in terms of what happened with Bosnian refugees here, but I will go to a little bit to explain what is happening in Bosnia now. As Hungary, Serbia, and Croatia are pushing away refugees from their borders, they are rerouted to enter into Bosnia. And so there are two towns through which they cross the border. One is with the border with Croatia, and another one the border with Serbia. So as they come into Bosnia, they are finding themselves in a country that is unstable after the war and does not have resources to provide much needed protection. These are, some of these individuals are refugees from Afghanistan and some are from Syria, but many are different types of vulnerable immigrants who are trying to sort out their situation, to say. Many are refugees who have been separated from their family members who are currently in Italy, Germany, and other European Union countries. And so they are trying to find a way to reunite with their family members. So how this happens is that the borders between Bosnia and Croatia, Bosnia and Serbia, and also Croatia and Hungary are using very aggressive techniques to push people outside of their borders, so they do end up in Bosnia. One of the cities that is experiencing the extreme influx of immigrants to Bosnia is the city of Bihać, which has 61,000 inhabitants. It's rather a small town with beautiful river, but is absolutely unequipped to receive that type of vulnerable population. So what the local authorities have done is that they have used a burned down building that was destroyed during the war in the 90s, and they have put thousands of people in there. This building doesn't have windows, doesn't have heating. Bosnia is a very cold country, so these people are sleeping on the floor. Not just that they are put in horrible conditions, but also what is happening in Bosnia is now some sort of a clash with local population, if you were to say, in terms of struggling for resources, right? And so there is pressure now on Bosnian authorities to try to find resources to fund a location where refugees would be relocated from the city center. 1,000 people recently demonstrated in the city demanding that immigrants should be moved away from the city center. I think what's also important to say is that many of these immigrants and also refugees are dark-skinned and they are Muslim, and they come from countries that are not desirable in Europe. Due to growing Islamophobia worldwide, Bosnian Serbs and Croats within Bosnia that is divided into 3 ethnic pockets. One is Republika Srpska, where Serbs predominantly live. Another one is a federation that is mixed between Bosniaks and Croats. They have been seeking referendum to separate from Bosnia as a state for quite some time. And so this new population that is brought into the country is really used as a tool to show that there may be a threat of terrorist attacks or politicization of trying to build a sentiment where these immigrants would not be perceived as welcomed. Globalization had brought us this shrinking of spaces, right, that I mentioned. So how this plays out in Bosnia now is very interesting, or how this plays out worldwide is very interesting to see in the most recent case that we saw in New Zealand, right? Brenton Tarrant, who is Australian national and killed 50 individuals, 50 Muslims during the prayer in Al Nur Mosque in New Zealand, found inspiration from Bosnian Serbs. And similarly, Anders Breivik from Norway, who killed 77 people. New York Times, March 15th, article written by Patrick Kinsley says that as Tarrant live-streamed killings from the car, he played a song celebrating Radovan Karadzic. So this really is showing why recognition of genocide is critical. So as most Europe is experiencing anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and long-existing hatred against Roma, who are seen as threat to white European values, vulnerable people are seen as a burden to the social system, and they are also seen as burden on the national economy and local infrastructure. What we see is happening in most of Europe is rise of right-wing populist nationalism. Italy, Sweden, Germany, and Hungary have seen the rise of right-wing parties. The new governments of Italy and Austria are made of Italian coalition of right-wing five-star movement, and also the radical right-wing party of Austria. We have also seen here Southern Poverty Law Center in the US has also been showing the rise of hate crimes in response to threat to national values, cultural, economic, and social norms. So when recently asked how Europe is managing immigrant crisis, whether Europe is dealing with this immigrant crisis in the right way, whether this immigrant crisis is over, Filippo Grandi, who is the chief of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, said that when considering the 70 million people have been uprooted worldwide, and that 90% of them are not in Europe, and they are not in the United States, and they are not in Australia, we have to really appreciate where the crisis is. These are middle-income countries, and that's where the problems are in terms of adapting to all these changes and pressures. 90% of refugees just crossed the border and they stayed there. The number of arrivals in the European Union from 2015, which was the highest, from 1 million, fell to 186,000 in 2017, according to the IOM, International Organization for Migration. So how do we respond to this influx of people is a problem, right? So Grande said that when Angela Merkel said that Syrian refugees are welcome in Germany, and the rest of Europe didn't join her, that's where the problem is. It is European duty to receive people fleeing persecution. And it's not a matter of kindness or charity, but it's also legal obligation, as Grandi says. So the system that was created after World War II is crumbling, and a way that Europe could show its values is by showing the ways in which they could unite in strengthening refugee policies, and that they are willing to help. And recent UN Compact for Refugees and Immigrants policy that's signed by 164 countries is perhaps a step in the right direction. This document is basically outlining 4 key priorities. First one is to work together in terms of regulating migration to ensure that it's safe and orderly. Second criteria is to optimize the benefit of migration. Third one is to address the risks immigrants are experiencing from their home countries, transit country, and in destination countries, and also work on dispelling narratives around immigrants. United States, Australia, Austria, Chile, and Bulgaria, and Israel did not commit to the plan as they feel it's a threat to their sovereignty. So the plan sounds great, right? And Europe is, most of the world is committed to do something about it. But at the same time, the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker recently announced that the European Union will upgrade its 1,500 border guards to 10,000 armed border guards to tackle unlawful migration by 2020. So what does this tell us? There are many reasons why people flee countries. Some of them are in need of protection due to climate changes, desertification, flood, famine, gangs, domestic violence, and also, although they do not all necessarily qualify for protection under the Refugee Convention, what is needed is expanding the norms of protection, and that's what Susan said as well. The point of the values should be looked at broadly in terms of what states do and how they respond to the pressure, and how could we safeguard immigrant and refugee rights and consider that most conflicts will not end anytime soon. So this is probably going to go on for quite some time. So instead of providing an answer to a difficult question, maybe we can just think about the ways in which the states could approach diplomacy in different ways. How can we ensure that United Nations Security Council is addressing problems on time before they become a part of major humanitarian crisis? I watched recently a talk by Alex Thomas Alienkov, who was a deputy of UNHCR and formerly law professor and dean at Georgetown University Law Center, who had this talk with the American Society of International Law. And he also mentioned, and I echoed, that I think is very much part of some sort of solution for us to think about. How do we reclaim the word refugee and immigrant? What they mean now is something else, right? We have absolutely stripped the words of their meanings and values, or that would carry any type of respect that we would have for these groups. So how can we reclaim the words, and how can we share the burden to better help those that are fleeing prosecution? Big question, but that's it. Thank you.
What we wanted to do was give everybody a chance to ask a few questions. So Susan is coming up, Alma's coming back after she has a little water, and we were going to spend 15, 20 minutes, whatever you would like, to ask some questions and continue the conversation. So who would like to start? Susan?
I have one for each of them, and I guess I'll just go to this last.
Does the TV person need us to be at the podium?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
we're
okay.
being filmed.
We'll answer from here.
We're being filmed by CAN TV, public access. Just so you know, we're all going to be famous. So go ahead, Susan.
People will tell you when you come to the grocery store. I saw you.
Shoot your last question to us about refugee and immigrant.
Yes.
What can we use something from displaced person? Although we have the SNL skits that Steve Martin did about the DPs, certainly go down a rabbit hole, but nevertheless, would displaced person help us, remind us what's going on?
Well, the frame I was using for it is forced migration. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the International Association of Forced Migration, because there I thought, this is a rather utopian article I wrote about 8 years ago, which I don't think is going to fly right now. But if you want to think, one way to analyze it is that populations tend to be more receptive to people who they regard as having left their homes because of forces beyond their control. And so if we take a broad look at forced migration, you can say that, and this is really the next generation's issue, people who are fleeing conditions caused by climate change, whether they are short-term disasters, greatly increased powerful storms, or longer-term disasters caused by climate change like desertification, and crops are not viable in the way that they once were, that maybe that's a way to talk about it. And then I put a human rights frame on it, so if you can say that someone left where they were because the state has either violated their human rights or failed to protect their human rights, which is how you get this criminal violence stuff in it, because the state is failing to protect your right to life. Maybe that's a way to frame it. I think this is a legislative non-starter right now, and Alma was talking about the Global Compact on Migration, which I think was a very long exercise, but even in the Global Compact, they wouldn't really account for mixed populations, where you have people who are fleeing for a mixture of reasons. They were determined to keep the binary divide between immigrants and refugees, and I think you're right in saying it's not a viable way to look forward. Things don't come in such neat categories all the time, even though we lawyers are always trying to put things in neat categories.
I definitely agree with that. But I think also we have to appreciate, even when we are talking about refugees, what it means today, the kinds of warfares we have, how we understand aggression, how we understand wars today is different than it was before. So what does fear of prosecution mean today? Persecution mean today. So yeah, so these are really interesting and timely questions to think about, how we have evolved over the years and where we are today and how we understand these concepts.
My other question, I did have
the chance, as it happened, to read the article that you referred to in the New York Times on Sunday. So my question is, can we unpack that spoke a lot about the danger to a woman's lives.
Yeah.
And not only the fact that it was domestic abuse or just whatever, but that there has been a change in that they are being, this is what the organizations that are working with them to recover, they have noticed increased torture. Yes, basically women being skinned, their breasts being cut off, their buttocks being cut off before they are killed, which has not been an attribute until recently. So my question then is, what's the breakdown? We have more between men and women that are coming, and is there a way then that also helps us inform about what we should think about in that, even that whole aspect of violence?
Yeah, the situations that Sonia Nasario is talking about in that article so clearly amount to torture that I think if you look at the Convention Against Torture, and there it doesn't matter, the standard is that it either has to be through state acquiescence or their failure to control forces that are likely to torture someone. That's torture, what she's describing. It's really awful.
Do we have statistics about the demographics of this population of people on the move?
The people on the move are mostly women and kids, but there are men, and we just had a visit in Chicago last week from a nun, Sister Magda, who runs one of the largest sets of shelters in Mexico. There's a very well-developed network of shelters run by not the diocesan Catholic Church, but by various orders like the Jesuits and various groups of nuns. And they will tell you, there are some people in amongst the caravans who are there to see what they can do to exploit the other people who are along for it. But the stories of people who are fleeing real danger and ought to be embraced and welcomed. She complains that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Mexico is only interested in a very narrow proportion of the people coming through. But she says, as someone who acts from humanitarian impulses, she's not going to distinguish between someone who has been persecuted because they're a journalist and somebody whose life is being threatened by a criminal organization because she protested, for example, their murder of a relative or sexual assault. So it's a hard thing it's hard to distinguish among a mixed population like that. The UN might manage to do it in a very neat binary way, immigrants, refugees, but that's not what the reality is that Sister Magda is seeing in the people coming out of Central America.
Hi, my name's Wendy, and I'm from Frederick Booth in 81. So I tend to think of all these public policy, my field has been public policy, but is what economic incentives can we create for people to do the right thing, in particular behavioral economics. So I'm sort of drawing on what the comment Susan made about when immigrants, particularly from Mexico, as she mentioned, were welcome in the United States because of the need for additional labor. And I'm here with a lovely guest, Betty, and we worked together for 14 years on her legal immigration and green card. It took 14 years. So my thought, because of that experience and my studies and your comment is there a way to create through legislation an incentive to have industries that are lacking workers, we know there are plenty of them now with their very low unemployment, to basically sponsor people, and in a different way from.
Well, this is already in the law, but the Trump administration is determined to disassemble, despite the economic consequences, many of the programs that let in temporary workers, permanent workers. What they are interested in expanding are the H-2As and H-2Bs, who are the temporary guest workers, although the word guest should not be used for the way that they're often treated. And one of the problems with that program as a structural factor is the non-portability of the visas. You are certified to come in and work for only one employer. If you don't like the conditions, you will be deported. I mean, we even did a case in my law firm of an employer in Tennessee who, when his workers, H-2A workers, started complaining about the conditions, he actually rented a bus, forced them on the bus, and drove them and had them driven down to the Texas-Mexico border. He was like deporting his own workforce because he didn't like them. If there's no visa portability, some of the terms that have been used by like the Southern Poverty Law Center, Farm Worker Justice Center for the Rights of Migrants to describe these programs are like close to slavery, no way to treat a guest. So as we look at the potential expansion of vulnerable workers who are going to produce, because for them, the advantage is they get across the border safely. They don't have to risk walking through the desert. They're not directly exploited by smugglers. But it's not a way we want to live. We have 300 million people in the United States. We are at a full employment economy, and we have a president who wanted to close the Mexican border until someone explained to him that we have a completely integrated automotive industry. And then when he backed off of it, you can tell he still doesn't understand it, because he said, if they don't do something in a year, we're going to block Mexican cars from coming in. I don't think there is such a thing as a Mexican car, because really our auto industry in terms of parts manufacture and assembly is completely integrated on both sides of the border. And any of us could try to figure out the origins of the parts in any of our cars. It's not very simple, and it's quite integrated. So I wouldn't mind if they expand guest worker programs, but they've got to provide more protections like visa portability, and so that you can leave a bad employer and go to a better one. They can do it by sector. They certify you to come work in the hotel industry. They certify you to come work in the seafood processing industry. But allowing the workers some freedom of mobility, I think, would go a long way towards ending some of the abuses.
May I just add quickly? I don't, because I wasn't really referring to the visa programs. I know a number of the problems with that. I was referring to the refugees. Would someone sponsor refugees, which we've done a little bit in Chicago, with programs like Refugee One, but I'm thinking of employment opportunities for refugees. Now, I can't comment on what the legal state.
Well, that's generally part of the overseas refugee program is the social services agencies that work with them, which are called voluntary agencies, the VOLAGs, like Jewish Federation, Lutheran Refugee Services, et cetera, have arrangements with employers. And weren't there some meat processors in Iowa that were really eager to get in lawful Bosnian refugees when their Mexican unauthorized workforce got deported? So it isn't that there's some magic economic incentive that's going to overcome the basic racism and xenophobia and crowd pleasing, that the Republican Party seems to be in now. I just saw that Chris Kobach has been mentioned as being nominated for Secretary of DHS, and Chris Kobach, a number of years ago, persuaded a number of towns around the country, Farmers Branch, Texas, I'm forgetting some of the town in Pennsylvania, that they should enact anti-immigrant laws to not allow illegal aliens, in quotes, to be able to rent houses or live in their communities. All of those communities got sued by the ACLU. It cost them tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to defend unconstitutional, unlawful local ordinances that Chris Kobach had persuaded them that he made thousands of dollars advising them. I don't think he's going to be Secretary of DHS, but it's a signal of where the president wants to go.
I really like the direction you took, Alma, to identify ways to change the language, because I think in this current climate in the U.S., that's what we need. That right now, a lot of the former terms are completely toxic and reactive, and we have to define it differently. And forced migration is one way, but I think that's too high level for for lots of people. I mean, we have whole industries that are in trouble. I live in West Michigan. The fruit growing business is really nearly dead, and it's being driven that way faster by the development of lakeshore property that used to grow fruit. But once Mexicans were kept in this country and couldn't go back, as they had been doing for generations, the people who've been here a while don't want to continue to pick fruit, and there's nobody to pick the fruit. But they describe themselves as being stuck in.
Right, because there's no more circularity. If they were to go back home, they may have lived here. I think the average stay of unauthorized Mexicans in the U.S. is that they've been here more than 12 years. The majority of that community of unauthorized Mexicans, because they're afraid to go home, because if they go home, they aren't going to be able to get back. And there's no mechanism for them to become legal residents with a path to citizenship while they stay here until we have another Immigration Reform and Control Act like we did in '86. But that enterprise failed in the 1990s and early 2000s.
There are lots of businesses. I mean, I think that there are sectors of the population who understand pieces of the problem. And there should be a way to identify different language that would bring in more people, like in the middle of the country.
The Chicago Council on Global Affairs has done a really interesting series of reports backed by corporate entities across the region about the benefits of immigration to the Midwest. And so I would go to the Council on Global Affairs website if you want to see a business push that's pro-immigration. Unfortunately, they're losing ground within the Republican Party. The people I call the Wall Street Republicans are losing control of their own party to people who are really in favor of not making America great again, but making America white again. It's part of the census question about citizenship. It's part of a lot of the policies that are being applied.
No.
Sure. So a quick question for both of you, but particularly for Susan. I know you recognize the fact that immigration has a positive economic impact, has had a positive economic impact for the United States for the most part, but yet the current administration is portraying immigration now as a threat to our existence, right? Now, I don't know if you will agree or not with this idea that they are using that as a tool to divert the discussion from other important issues.
Of course.
And yet, what do you think will be the concern, the implications of creating this sense of xenophobia? How that could affect the stability of our society? And could we end up having a situation like the Nazi Germany, where nationalism...
Well, we already do. We had the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh. Some relatives of mine are members of that congregation. Thank God they weren't among the people who got killed. You have, acts inspired by that I just saw someone was arrested for threatening to kill Representative Ilhan Omar, the member of Congress from Minnesota. And so I think we're already in it. I think that there are people who think that they're right when they're acting on those kinds of impulses. And given that we have a rather open society, I don't know how you come up with mechanisms to prevent that don't result in our feeling like we're living in a police state. It's a very difficult situation.
Yeah, definitely. I would also add that Europe also has great advantages that they would want to see in terms of receiving immigrants and refugees to their territories, because they have aging population. So for their economy, it would be beneficial to have 50% of these people on the go, according to UNHCR, are children, right? So this is very young population that could certainly benefit the economy. But I think also due to xenophobia and racism that we see worldwide is really the issue that there are no programs that would think about integrating this population and ensuring that there are programs that can allow for that.
This morning I heard Mark Krikorian on the radio. He's head of a conservative restrictionist think tank in Washington called the Center for Immigration Studies. He used to be part of something called the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And I remember being on a panel with him in front of a bunch of journalists about, more than a decade ago, where he was touting Japan as a country that has successfully managed an aging population without admitting immigrants because, for example, they had developed a kind of machine where someone could be, an elderly person could be seated in it, and then it's kind of like those cartoons of like, remember the washing machine? You'd be seated in it and it would close around you, and then one attendant could monitor 8 people in these machines that would then wash them, and that saves you having to add a labor force. I went home and said to my then about 84-year-old mother, I said, Mom, would you rather be stuffed in a washing machine or have this, really nice Nigerian woman who you've hired bathe you? And I said in that panel with Krikorian, I said, I understood how that could work. I didn't want to live in that kind of society. You had your hand up a while ago. I've been waiting.
Completely cynical or, jaundiced, but has our immigration policy just been ruled by economic expediency and by political expediency? And have we just sort of taken in refugees because it made us look that we were a legitimate society as opposed to the influence of the Soviet?
I think the entire refugee system depends on nation states having as part of their self-interest that they have humanitarian policies and that they are willing to trade a bit of their sovereignty for an international good, which is that people fleeing danger have a place to go. That's the basis of the agreement for the Refugee Convention. But when you have leaders like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the new right-wing parties in Italy, all trying to bar the door, I think that consensus, which was based in part historically on the North Atlantic Alliance, you look at the words of the Atlantic Charter that Churchill and Roosevelt wrote in 1941, even before the U.S. was in the war, that there was a basic agreement about supporting human rights and the dignity of individuals and their security. I unfortunately see a lot of cracks in that system right now, and a system that depended on the successful defense of human rights through a process which was called naming and shaming actually requires that there be governments that can be shamed, and where you get unabashedly authoritarian leaders, Duterte, Bolsonaro, I mean, it's just, it's an ever-engaging list. That kind of international consensus is quite endangered.
But these sort of like right-wing reactionary politicians are a consequence of domestic austerity measures in this sense that there's scarcity, right, and imposed upon. Would these leaders exist?
I think it's less scarcity than it is inequality. Mm-hmm. And what you see, I mean, I have cousins who live in Budapest who are part of the anti-Orban movement, and what they see is that there has been so much harm done in the society by the retrenchment of the state from social welfare programs, which may have during the communist era existed together with programs that repressed dissent, that controlled the press, etc. But the basic human services of care for the elderly, access to health care and stuff are just vanishing, and that creates a lot of insecurity among people who aren't wealthy. And therefore, they have, it's very common to point to an other as the person to blame for that. The authorities don't want them blaming them.
Yes, I'm sorry, I would like to stand, but it's
That's
very
okay.
hard. I started working with refugees with Ms. Begich in 1994. A few months after the refugees arrived, Oklahoma City blew up. We were afraid of all Muslims then. Most of the people in Bosnia were Muslims that came here. All of a sudden there was fear among the refugees because of the behavior of our population.
Of our part, because Oklahoma City was
That's right.
done by a white guy.
That's right. The point is, the fear was then transferred over to somebody else, but once they figured out who really did it, I didn't see anybody running around saying, oh, aren't we ashamed? They'll just figure out who to plant it on next. And,
Actually, George Bush was better after 2001, after 9/11, than anything that he makes. Trump makes him look really good.
Yes.
And Bush was actually pretty good at the national level at trying to set a tone to say, don't attack your Muslim neighbors. Now, the policies they instituted of massive roundups of Muslim men in the New Jersey, the tri-state area, et cetera, and later, sort of were the opposite of that. But there was not the kind of blatant fear-mongering that we're getting today.
Yeah, I guess my point is, and I don't know if there's a question or an answer here, but we are populated by the terrorists of our society, and they're all around us, and it's really handy to put them onto somebody else. But with the refugees, I hope that we can find a way to make our society look like a warm and lovely place to live in, let alone refugees or anybody else. We gotta learn to handle ourselves. It's a very hard job.
Ban assault weapons.
Yes.
Oh, that's it.
Shut down gun shows. There.
So this is what New Zealand did, right? So this is how it can be done, right?
Well, we just
Yeah.
have to have a woman president.
Yes, I think that's what Kathleen said, we need these nurturing powers.
I'm wondering if you could both, thank you both very much, if you could give us one kind of hope. When you look at the situation we're in today, what is the one thing you say, you know what, I leave with you this idea, we can do it. So Alma, would you start please, and then Susan. Thank you.
Yes, I think for me, even though, we spoke about flaws in the human rights system and how problematic it is, to me, it still does give hope, that there are people with the values where they understand that we are good, that we need to stick for each other, that we need to recognize, that we need to protect each other. I think that's what it is at the core level. I mean, on my way here, I was in a car, a man drove the car, gave me a ride here by Lyft, and he is an African American who lives in Indiana, and he told me that yesterday his grandson was killed, and in a really senseless shooting. And I was absolutely shaken to think about the ways in which we are talking today about immigration crisis and refugee crisis worldwide, and what kind of issues we are dealing with. And yet here, this is somebody's reality every day. These weapons that we have on the streets are killing constantly.
Get rid of President Trump in 2020. His reelection is going to continue on a path of dismantling of the rule of law, the proliferation of arms, and I think that's what we have to do. And I don't mind being completely partisan.
Maybe one more question. Is there anybody? Sir?
Yeah. One of the terms that floats around through your discussion is the intent to integrate or the desire to integrate people, but so much of the thrust is negative that people have to leave somewhere, right? They're starving, they're under threat. So there's sort of two forces here. One, coming to somewhere like Europe or the United States doesn't mean you want to integrate, it means you want to live, right? But there's pressure that is put internally in some of the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric, about people who don't want to integrate. Can you prove they want to integrate? What can bridge the crisis for the refugees who simply have to be somewhere where they can live, but they're held on the one hand to the standard of integratability, and on the other, survivability? See where there's a gap there.
I think the U.S. has done a pretty good job. If you look at this idea of unwillingness to integrate, in the U.S. at least, I can't speak to the European experience because they seem to have sort of more solid enclaves of refugees who have not, but we're a country that assimilates people, and if you look at social sciences research, you'll see that one of the problems, in quotes, that immigrant and refugee families have is by the second generation, their kids are so Americanized that they are afraid that they're losing their own culture. So these ideas that, I remember doing a case years ago against the village of Addison, where people in the city council said, I don't like hearing Spanish spoken in the streets. And then they had a failed attempt to tear down the Mexican neighborhood. We beat them in federal court. We got $7 million for the people whose houses had been torn down. And, it's like by the next generation, it's going to be a non-issue as people come in. So the U.S., I think, has a pretty good sense of it. We have a very seductive culture, and immigrant and refugee kids alike seem to do fairly well at becoming part of it. I'm not sure why France has so much of a problem. I think there's a notion of, well, anybody can be French, but you have to be French only within a certain range of a definition of what French is. For example, they're banned on wearing hijabs in school, or Mogen David stars like I have. You can't wear those in schools in France. You can wear crosses, but not stars. I mean, so how the French deal with assimilation and Frenchness is different enough from the way things are approached here that I think we're more successful at it than they are, with all the flaws, given flaws of our society.
Excellent. I can connect to this. I have a friend who's French, and we had a conversation about this. And he's very radical in the ways in which he approaches how foreigners should assimilate, right? It is by abandoning all your whatever it is you come with and becoming French. That means speaking French, adopting to the dress code and all that. And so we were talking about hijab at one point. He's a detective in a high police precinct, whatever. Anyway, so we had this conversation about Muslims, and he said to me, well, we have a problem with Muslims here. They are not integrating here, and they continue to wear hijab, and this is a problem for us. They need to be French, and by that we mean that they should respect our way of being French, right? And I said to him, okay, just by that time, I read a really interesting article. I don't remember where, but it was really interesting. It was an English teacher who had a student in his class who was wearing hijab. And so he writes about his own contemplations about how does he handle this student. And he said, well, I was thinking maybe she's going to cheat in the exams. I don't know who this person is. She's completely covered. She has only this part open. It could be anybody, right? So he was thinking, how does he approach education with this person? And
Whose face he can't see.
Whose face he cannot see. He was hoping that he can recognize the voice. If she's speaking, that he will be able to understand this is a woman with consistency in her voice. But anyway, what happened a few months after, she came wearing jeans and normal clothes and just had a scarf on her, covering her hair. And he was shocked. He said, so what happened? She said, well, I don't actually feel pressure to be covered anymore. When identity is threatened, that's when people have need to reinforce it. When it's welcomed and accepted, then they feel free to be, simply just to be. Thank you.